I had always thought of myself as a pretty ordinary guy. My life wasn't perfect, but whose is? I had my routines, my daily habits that I clung to, and for the most part, they got me through the day. Some of these habits were good, like waking up early to make coffee, reading the news on my phone, and walking to work instead of taking the bus. Others, well, they were the kind of habits that I knew weren't exactly helping me. But I never thought they were hurting me either. I mean, how bad could smoking a few cigarettes a day really be? It started out harmless enough. I was a teenager, hanging out with friends, and someone offered me a cigarette. I didn't even like it the first time, but everyone else was doing it, and I wanted to fit in. At that age, you think you're invincible, like nothing can really hurt you. So I took a drag, coughed a bit, and then laughed it off. It was no big deal, just something to pass the time while we sat on the steps outside the school, talking about nothing and everything. And slowly, it became a habit. A part of who I was. Over the years, that habit became more than just a way to fit in or pass the time. It became a crutch. A cigarette was what I reached for when I was stressed, when I was bored, when I was tired, when I had something to celebrate. It was my companion during long commutes, my solace after a tough day at work, and my excuse for taking a break when life felt overwhelming. I knew it wasn't good for me. I could feel it in the way my lungs burned after a night of smoking more than usual, or the way I coughed in the mornings. But it didn't seem like a big deal, and I always told myself I'd quit someday. Just not today. My friends would tease me about it sometimes, and I'd laugh it off. I know. It's bad for me, I'd say, taking another drag. I'll quit one day. Just not today. It became a kind of running joke, and in a way that made it easier to ignore the truth. Because as long as I could laugh about it, it didn't feel like something I needed to worry about. I didn't really think about how much I depended on smoking until I tried to quit for the first time. I remember it was New Year's Eve, and I had made a resolution that this would be the year I'd finally quit. I lasted maybe 2 days. By the end of the second day, I was irritable, snapping at people for no reason, and all I could think about was how much I wanted a cigarette. The stress, the cravings, the feeling that something was missing. It was overwhelming. So I gave up. Told myself it wasn't the right time, that I'd try again later. But later kept getting pushed back, and before I knew it, years had passed, and I was still lighting up every day. It wasn't just about the nicotine. It was the ritual of it, the way it made me feel like I had a moment to myself, a few minutes where everything else could fade into the background. I would step outside, light a cigarette, and it was like pressing pause on the world. Those few minutes were mine, and no one could take them from me. I needed that, or at least I thought I did. It was the one thing that was always there, constant, reliable, when everything else felt chaotic and out of control. Of course, there were the warnings. The health campaigns, the pictures on the cigarette packs, the concerned looks from my doctor during checkups. But it's easy to ignore something when you don't see the consequences right away. I wasn't coughing up blood, I wasn't hooked up to an oxygen tank, so I convinced myself I was fine. I'd quit before things got that bad. I just needed to find the right time, the right motivation. But the thing about life is that it has a way of catching up to you when you least expect it. And that's exactly what happened to me one Friday morning. It was supposed to be just another ordinary day. I woke up, groggily got out of bed, and went through my usual routine. Shower, breakfast, coffee, and of course, a cigarette before heading out. I remember stepping outside, the air still cool from the night, and lighting up. I took that first drag, feeling the familiar burn in my throat, and then exhaled, watching the smoke drift lazily into the sky. It was comforting in a strange way, like a small piece of my day that was always the same, no matter what else was going on. But that morning, something felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was this tightness in my chest that didn't go away, even after I finished my cigarette. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just stress or maybe I hadn't slept well. I went back inside, grabbed my bag, and headed out the door. As I walked to the train station, I noticed that the tightness was getting worse. It felt like someone was pressing down on my chest, and it was getting harder to breathe. I remember stopping in the middle of the sidewalk, trying to catch my breath. People were walking past me, barely noticing, and I just stood there gasping, wondering what was happening to me. My heart was pounding, and I felt this strange sensation, like everything around me was moving too fast. I tried to keep walking, but my legs felt weak, and I had to lean against a wall to steady myself. That's when the pain hit. It wasn't sharp, like a knife, but more like a dull, crushing weight. It spread across my chest and up into my jaw, and for a moment, I thought I was going to pass out. I remember thinking, this can't be happening. I'm too young for this. But there I was, in the middle of the street, clutching my chest, struggling to stay on my feet. Panic set in, and I fumbled for my phone, trying to call someone, anyone, for help. But my fingers felt numb, and I couldn't get the screen to unlock. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground, staring up at the sky. I could hear voices around me, but they sounded distant, like they were coming from underwater. I tried to focus, to stay conscious, but it was like my body was shutting down, one piece at a time. My vision blurred, and I felt this cold, creeping sensation spread through my limbs. It was the strangest thing, feeling my body go numb while my mind was still racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. I don't remember much after that. There were flashes of light, a siren wailing in the distance, and someone leaning over me, asking if I could hear them. I wanted to respond, but I couldn't. My mouth wouldn't move, and the words were stuck somewhere in my throat. I felt like I was slipping away, drifting further and further from everything around me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. For a brief moment, I thought about all the times I'd said I'd quit smoking, all the excuses I'd made, and how I'd always told myself there was plenty of time to change. But now, lying there on the pavement, I realized how fragile everything really was. How quickly things could change, and how little control I actually had. It was terrifying, that feeling of helplessness, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and there was no way to step back. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went black. It wasn't like falling asleep or closing your eyes. It was like being swallowed whole by the dark, with no sense of time or space. I couldn't feel my body anymore, couldn't hear the sounds of the street, the voices, the sirens. There was just nothing. An emptiness that stretched on forever, and in that emptiness, I felt myself slipping away, like a drop of water dissolving into the ocean. I don't know how long I was lost in that darkness. It felt like an eternity, but also like no time had passed at all. There was nothing to hold on to, nothing to ground me. Just an endless, suffocating blackness that stretched in every direction. It was as if I had been stripped of everything, my senses, my thoughts, even my sense of self. All that was left was this cold, crushing void, and I felt small, insignificant, like a speck floating in an infinite abyss. And then, out of the darkness, I became aware of something. At first, it was just a faint presence, something I could barely sense. But slowly, it grew stronger, and I realized I wasn't alone. There were shapes in the darkness, shadows that moved silently around me, circling, watching. They didn't have faces, at least not that I could see, but I could feel their eyes on me, like cold fingers brushing against my skin. It was a strange and unsettling feeling, knowing I was being observed, yet not being able to see who or what was out there. As the shapes drew closer, I began to make out their forms more clearly. They were tall, hunched figures, almost human but not quite. Their bodies were shrouded in darkness, and they seemed to blend into the shadows around them, as if they were made of the same black void that surrounded me. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, gliding rather than walking, and as they circled me, I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something malevolent about them, a sense of quiet, creeping dread that made my skin crawl. I wanted to speak, to ask who they were, what they wanted, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, like it was being squeezed shut, and all I could do was watch as the shadows drew closer and closer. The closer they came, the more I could feel their presence, a cold, heavy weight that seemed to press down on me, making it harder to breathe. It was as if the darkness was alive, and it was slowly closing in around me, suffocating me. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, unable to move or speak, as the shadows circled me. It felt like hours, maybe even days. Time didn't seem to exist in that place. But then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, one of the figures stepped forward, separating itself from the others. This one was different, taller, more defined, and as it moved closer, I could see that it wasn't shrouded in complete darkness like the others. There was a faint, flickering light around it, like the glow of a dying ember, and as it approached, I could see the outline of its face. It was a face I recognized, and yet it was distorted, twisted into something almost unrecognizable. The skin was pale, almost sickly, and the eyes were dark, empty pits that seemed to pull me in, making it hard to look away. But it wasn't the face itself that filled me with dread. It was the smile. A cold, mocking smile that stretched across its lips, as if it knew something I didn't, and it was amused by the fact that I was so afraid. I wanted to run, to turn and flee into the darkness, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. The figure continued to move closer, and as it did, I felt a strange familiar scent wafting through the air. It was the smell of smoke, of burning tobacco, and I realized with a jolt that it smelled just like the cigarettes I used to smoke. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as the figure stopped in front of me, its dark eyes boring into mine. "Did you really think you could escape this?" it said, its voice low and raspy, like the hiss of smoke escaping from a lit cigarette. "Did you think you could keep ignoring it forever?" I didn't know how to respond. My mind was a whirl of confusion and fear, and all I could do was stand there, staring at the figure in front of me. It felt like it was reading my thoughts, digging through my memories, and as it spoke, I could feel its words echoing inside my head, loud and insistent. "You always knew what you were doing to yourself," it continued, its tone almost taunting. "Every time you lit up, every time you took a drag, you knew. You could feel it, deep down. But you ignored it. You told yourself you had time, that it didn't matter." The words stung, cutting through the fog of fear and confusion, and I felt a pang of guilt twist in my chest. I had always known, on some level, that smoking was killing me. I had seen the warnings, felt the tightness in my lungs, the wheeze in my breath. But I had chosen to ignore it, to push it aside, because it was easier than facing the truth. And now, standing there in the dark, with this figure looming over me, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The figure seemed to sense my thoughts, and its smile widened, becoming even more twisted, more grotesque. "You're weak," it said, and there was a cruel, mocking edge to its voice. "You always have been. That's why you never quit. You couldn't. You needed it, didn't you? Even when it was destroying you." I wanted to scream, to shout back that it wasn't true, that I wasn't weak. But the words were stuck in my throat, choked off by the cold, suffocating weight of the darkness. The figure moved closer, its face mere inches from mine, and I could see the way its dark eyes seemed to shimmer, reflecting the faint, flickering light around it. "You're going to die," it whispered, the words sharp and final. "And it's all because of you. Because you were too weak to stop." I felt a wave of panic surge through me, and I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped, pinned in place by the cold, invisible grip of the darkness. The figure watched me struggle, and I could see the amusement in its eyes, as if it was enjoying watching me squirm. It leaned in closer, its breath hot and acrid, smelling of smoke and ash, and I felt its lips brush against my ear as it spoke again. "You could have stopped this," it said, its voice barely more than a whisper. "But you didn't. You chose this. You chose to let it consume you." The words echoed in my mind, and I felt a crushing sense of despair wash over me. It was true. I had chosen this. I had made excuses, ignored the warnings, convinced myself that I had time. And now, it was too late. I was standing on the edge of the abyss, staring into the darkness, and there was no way to turn back. The figure straightened, pulling away from me, and I could see the satisfaction in its twisted smile. "You belong to us now," it said, and its voice was low, almost a growl. "You belong to the darkness." As it spoke, the other shadows began to close in, their dark, shapeless forms surrounding me, pressing in from all sides. I could feel their cold, bony fingers reaching out, brushing against my skin, and I felt a scream build in my throat, but no sound came out. I was trapped, drowning in the darkness, and there was nothing I could do to escape. Just when I thought I was about to be swallowed whole, a flash of light cut through the darkness, blindingly bright, like a bolt of lightning. The shadows recoiled, hissing and shrinking back, and for a moment I was alone, bathed in the warm golden light. I squinted, trying to see where the light was coming from, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw a figure standing in the distance, bathed in the glow. It was hard to make out their features, but there was something about them that felt familiar, comforting. The light grew stronger, pushing back the shadows, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest, easing the tightness, the fear. The figure began to move closer, and as they did, I realized they were not like the other shadows. They were taller, more solid, and their presence was calm, almost serene. The darkness seemed to shy away from them, retreating, and as they approached, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. When they were close enough, I could see their face, and it took my breath away. It was a face I recognized, but it wasn't twisted or cruel like the one I had seen before. It was kind, gentle, with eyes that seemed to shine with a warm, comforting light. They looked at me, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe again. "You're not alone," the figure said, their voice soft but firm. "You never were." The words hit me like a wave, and I felt tears sting my eyes. I hadn't realized how alone I had felt, how isolated I had been, until that moment. The figure reached out, their hand warm and steady, and I took it, feeling a surge of relief as their light enveloped me, pushing back the darkness. The shadows hissed and writhed, trying to claw their way back, but the light was too strong, and they couldn't get near. I could still hear their whispers, low and insistent, telling me I was weak, that I deserved this, but the figure's light drowned them out, filling my mind with a calm, steady warmth. "You made mistakes," the figure said, their voice gentle but unyielding. "But you don't have to let them define you. You can choose to be better." I felt a sob rise in my throat, and I clung to their hand, afraid that if I let go, the darkness would swallow me again. The figure's grip tightened, and they smiled, a soft, reassuring smile that made my heart ache with hope. "It's not too late," they said. "You can still change. You can still find your way back." The words echoed in my mind, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I believed them. I could feel the darkness trying to pull me back, but the light was stronger, brighter, and I clung to it, letting it guide me, letting it wash over me, until the shadows were nothing more than a distant, fading memory. The warmth of the figure's hand was like nothing I'd ever felt before. It wasn't just a physical sensation, it was deeper, more profound, as if the warmth was seeping into my very soul, melting away the cold that had been gripping me for so long. I clung to that feeling, afraid that if I let go, the darkness would return and swallow me whole. The light around us was bright, but not blinding, and I could see the shadows retreating, curling back into the depths, as if they were afraid of what stood before them. The figure's presence was comforting, but also powerful, like a shield protecting me from the dark. I realized then that this wasn't just a random encounter. This figure had come for me, to pull me back from the abyss. I didn't understand why or how, but at that moment, it didn't matter. All I knew was that I felt safe, and that was enough. "You're not lost," the figure said, their voice calm, steady, and soothing. "You've been wandering in the dark, but you don't have to stay there. You have the strength to find your way back." The words resonated deep within me, stirring something that I had buried long ago. I thought about all the times I had tried to quit smoking, how I had failed again and again, each failure chipping away at my self-esteem until I started to believe that I was too weak to ever change. It was easier to give in, to let the habit control me, than to face the disappointment of trying and failing. But hearing those words, spoken with such certainty, made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "How?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "I've tried, so many times. I don't know if I can." The figure's eyes softened, and they stepped closer, their light enveloping me completely. "It's not about how many times you've tried and failed," they said. "It's about the strength to keep trying, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. The darkness wants you to believe that you're powerless, but that's not true. You have a light inside you, even if you can't see it right now. It's still there, waiting for you to find it." I felt a lump form in my throat, and tears welled up in my eyes. I had always thought of myself as weak because I couldn't quit smoking, because I couldn't break free from the cycle that kept pulling me back in. But hearing those words, it was as if a weight had been lifted off my chest, and I could finally breathe. I wanted to believe that there was still light inside me, that I hadn't completely lost my way. "But what if it's too late?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What if I'm already lost?" The figure shook their head, and their expression was gentle, almost sad. "It's never too late," they said. "As long as you're willing to fight for it, as long as you have the will to change, it's never too late. You can still find your way back to the light. But you have to want it, truly want it, more than anything else." I thought about all the times I had said I would quit, all the empty promises I had made to myself, and how I had always found an excuse to go back. Stress, boredom, anxiety, there was always something. But standing there, bathed in that warm, comforting light, I realized that those excuses were just that, excuses. I had been hiding behind them because it was easier than facing the truth, easier than admitting that I was scared of failing, scared of the unknown. "What if I fail again?" I asked, my voice cracking. "What if I'm not strong enough?" The figure's smile was soft, reassuring. "Then you try again," they said simply. And again, until you succeed. Strength isn't about never failing. It's about not giving up, even when you do. Every time you choose to fight, every time you take a step towards the light, you grow stronger. The darkness may try to pull you back, but it can't hold you if you don't let it. I felt their words wash over me, soothing the fear that had been gnawing at my insides. It was like a bomb on a wound I didn't even realize I had. I had been so consumed by the idea of failing that I had forgotten how to hope, how to believe in myself. But as I stood there in the presence of this figure, I felt something stir inside me, a flicker of determination that I thought had been extinguished long ago. The figure raised their hand, and I saw a faint glowing light appear in their palm. It was small, no bigger than a candle flame, but it shone brightly, cutting through the darkness that still lingered around us. "This is your light," they said, holding it out to me. "It's always been there, even when you couldn't see it. It's the part of you that refuses to give up, that fights to keep going, no matter how dark things get. Hold on to it, and let it guide you." I hesitated, staring at the light in their hand. It was beautiful, delicate, and yet there was a strength to it, a resilience that seemed to defy the darkness around us. Slowly, I reached out, my fingers trembling, and took the light from the figure's hand. As soon as it touched my skin, I felt a warmth spread through my body, a warmth that chased away the cold, numbing fear that had been gripping me. It was as if a part of me that had been dormant for so long had finally been awakened, and I could feel its strength, its resolve pulsing within me. The figure watched me, their eyes shining with a gentle, unwavering light. "You're stronger than you think," they said. "The darkness will try to make you forget that, but you mustn't let it. No matter how many times you fall, no matter how many times you fail, your light will always be there, waiting for you to find it again." I clutched the glowing light in my hand, feeling its warmth seep into my skin, and I realized that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. The darkness was still there, lurking at the edges, but it didn't seem so overwhelming anymore. It was just a shadow, something that could be pushed back, something that I could fight. The figure stepped back, and I felt a pang of fear, as if I was losing something precious. "Are you leaving?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "I've never been far," they said. "And I won't be, even if you can't see me. But this is your journey, and you have to walk it yourself. I can guide you, but the strength to keep going, to keep fighting, has to come from you." I nodded, even though a part of me still felt scared. I knew they were right. This was something I had to do on my own. But now, I felt like I could. I had the light, my light, and I wasn't going to let it go out again. The figure began to fade, the light around them dimming, and I felt a surge of panic. "Wait." I called out. What if I can't do it?" Their voice was gentle, but firm, as they began to disappear into the light. "You can," they said. "You've already taken the first step. Trust in yourself, and keep moving forward. The darkness will always be there, but so will your light. And it will be enough." With those words, the figure vanished, and I was left standing alone, the glowing light still clutched tightly in my hand. The darkness around me seemed to press in, but it didn't scare me the way it had before. I could still hear the whispers, the voices that told me I was weak, that I would fail, but I didn't listen. Instead, I focused on the warmth of the light, the steady pulsing glow that seemed to beat in time with my own heart. I don't know how long I stood there in that strange, endless space, but eventually I felt a shift, a pull, as if something was tugging me back. The light in my hand grew brighter, and I felt myself being lifted, drawn upward, away from the darkness. The shadows tried to reach for me, their cold skeletal hands clawing at the edges of the light, but they couldn't get close. I was rising faster and faster, the light around me growing brighter, until there was nothing but pure, blinding white. And then, just as suddenly, I was awake. I gasped, my chest heaving as I sucked in a breath of air, my eyes flying open. I was back in the hospital, surrounded by bright, sterile lights, and the steady beep of machines filled my ears. For a moment, I was disoriented, unsure of where I was, but then I saw the faces around me, doctors, nurses, and a few people I recognized, looking down at me with a mix of relief and shock. I had made it back. I was alive. As the reality of my situation sank in, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, fear, confusion, and something else, something that I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. I didn't know what would happen next, or how I was going to change, but I knew that I had been given a second chance, a chance to find my way back to the light. The darkness hadn't won. Not yet. When I opened my eyes in the hospital, everything felt strange, almost surreal. The fluorescent lights above me seemed too bright, the sterile smell of antiseptic too sharp, and the sounds of beeping monitors too loud, echoing in my head like distant chimes. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I was really awake or if I was still trapped somewhere between life and whatever had been waiting for me in that darkness. But then I felt the rough texture of the hospital sheet under my fingers, the scratchy sensation of the 4-needle tape to my arm, and I knew I was back. I was alive. The room slowly came into focus, and I could see the anxious faces of doctors and nurses leaning over me, their expressions a mix of relief and amazement. They were saying something, but their voices were muffled, like I was hearing them from underwater. I caught fragments, words like cardiac arrest, stabilized, and lucky, but it was hard to make sense of them. My mind was still reeling from everything I had seen, everything I had felt. And then I saw her, standing at the edge of the room, her eyes wide with shock and her hand covering her mouth. It was my sister, Marie. She looked like she had been crying, her cheeks red and her hair slightly disheveled, as if she had rushed over without taking a moment to compose herself. When our eyes met, I saw a flicker of recognition, followed by a wave of relief that washed over her face, and before I could process what was happening, she was by my side, gripping my hand tightly. "You're awake," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh, thank God you're awake." I tried to speak, to tell her that I was okay, but my throat was dry, and the words came out as a hoarse, unintelligible croak. She didn't seem to care. She just kept holding my hand, like she was afraid that if she let go, I'd slip away again. I could see the relief in her eyes, but also something else, a question, a fear. Like she was trying to understand what had happened, but couldn't find the words to ask. The doctors eventually gave me something to drink, and once my throat wasn't so dry, I managed to get out a few words. "What happened?" "You had a heart attack," one of the doctors said, his voice calm and measured, as if he had explained this 1,000 times before. "Your heart stopped for a few minutes, but we were able to resuscitate you. You're very lucky. Most people don't make it back after something like that." Lucky. That word echoed in my mind, but it felt strange, almost hollow. Lucky wasn't the word I would have used to describe what I had been through. Terrifying, maybe. Eye-opening, definitely. But lucky? I wasn't sure. I thought about the darkness, the shadows, the figure who had tried to drag me down, and the light that had saved me, and I wondered if any of it had been real. Had it been a dream? A hallucination brought on by the lack of oxygen? Or was it something more? Over the next few days, as I lay in that hospital bed, those questions kept circling in my mind. I was exhausted, physically and mentally, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, what I had felt. I knew I should have been relieved to be alive, but a part of me was scared of what it all meant, of what I was supposed to do now. Because I knew deep down that I couldn't just go back to the way things were. Something had changed, something fundamental, and I couldn't ignore it. When I tried to talk about it, though, I was met with skepticism. The doctors chalked it up to my brain trying to make sense of a traumatic event. It's not uncommon for patients who've experienced cardiac arrest to have vivid dreams or hallucinations, one of them said. Your brain was deprived of oxygen, and that can lead to all sorts of strange experiences. I wanted to argue, to tell them that it hadn't felt like a dream, that it had been real, more real than anything I had ever experienced. But I could see the doubt in their eyes, the polite, patient expressions they gave me when I tried to explain. So I stopped trying. It was easier to just nod and let them believe what they wanted to believe. But deep down, I knew the truth. I knew that what I had seen wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Marie, bless her, tried to understand. When we were alone, she would ask me what it had been like, what I had seen, and I could tell she wanted to believe me. But even she struggled to wrap her head around it. "It sounds like a nightmare," she said once, after I had described the shadows and the figure that had spoken to me. "Maybe it was your mind's way of telling you that you need to take better care of yourself." She was right, in a way. But it wasn't just about taking better care of myself. It was about facing the darkness, about confronting the things I had been running from for so long. I didn't know how to explain that to her, so I just nodded, hoping she would understand. The hardest part was trying to make sense of what the light had shown me. It had been so clear in that moment, but now, lying in the hospital, it felt like a distant memory, like a dream that was slipping through my fingers. I wanted to hold on to it, to remember every word, every feeling, but the more I tried, the more it seemed to fade. A few days later, they told me I could go home. Marie offered to take me back to her place, just until I was back on my feet, but I insisted on going to my own apartment. I needed time to think, to process everything that had happened. So she drove me home, helped me inside, and then hesitated at the door, as if she wasn't sure she should leave me alone. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked, her eyes searching mine for some sign that I was really all right. I forced a smile, trying to reassure her. "Yeah," I said, even though I wasn't sure. "I just need some time. But I'll be okay." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded, gave me a hug, and left. And then I was alone, standing in my empty apartment, trying to figure out what to do next. I looked around at the familiar surroundings: the couch, the TV, the ashtray sitting on the coffee table with a half-smoked cigarette still resting in it, and I felt a strange sense of detachment, like I was looking at someone else's life. I hadn't thought about smoking since I'd woken up in the hospital, but now, seeing that cigarette, I felt a pang of longing, a familiar itch at the back of my mind. For a moment, I almost reached for it, almost gave in. But then I remembered the darkness, the shadows, and the figure that had whispered to me, telling me that I was weak, that I was destroying myself. And I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I didn't want to be that person anymore. I didn't want to keep giving in to something that was killing me, slowly but surely. But I also didn't know how to stop. I had tried before, and I had failed over and over again. What was different this time? Why would it be any different now? That night, I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, my mind racing. I kept thinking about what the figure of light had said to me, about finding my own light, about the strength to keep fighting, no matter how many times I failed. It was easy to say those things when I was standing in that warm, comforting glow, but here in the dark, it felt impossible. I was scared of failing again, scared of the darkness that I knew was still out there, waiting for me to slip up. But then I remembered the light, the way it had felt when I held it in my hand, the warmth and the strength that had pulsed through me. And I realized that I had to try. Even if I failed, even if it was hard, I had to keep trying, because the alternative was to let the darkness win, and I couldn't do that. I didn't want to live my life in fear anymore. The next morning, I made a decision. I gathered up all the cigarettes I had stashed around the apartment, the packs hidden in drawers and coat pockets, and I threw them away. I even dumped out the ashtray, scrubbing it clean until it didn't smell like smoke anymore. It felt good, cathartic, like I was cleansing my space of something toxic. But I knew that was just the first step. I started going to support groups, something I had always been too proud to do before. I thought I could quit on my own, that I didn't need help, but now I realized how wrong I had been. I needed to be around people who understood what I was going through, who wouldn't judge me or make me feel weak for struggling. And little by little, I began to find my footing. It wasn't easy. There were days when the cravings were so strong that I thought I would go mad, days when I felt like I was on the verge of giving up. But every time I felt myself slipping, I thought about the light, about the figure who had told me that I wasn't alone, that I had the strength to keep fighting. And I held on, one day at a time. I started to see small changes, subtle at first, but they were there. I could breathe easier. I didn't wake up with that tightness in my chest, that painful cough that used to be my constant companion. I began to feel more present, more alive, like I was slowly waking up from a long, foggy dream. And with every small victory, I felt my confidence grow, like I was reclaiming a part of myself that I had lost a long time ago. The darkness was still there, lurking at the edges, but it didn't scare me the way it used to. Because now, I knew that I had the light. And as long as I held on to it, as long as I kept fighting, I knew I could find my way back. It's been a few months since that day in the hospital, but sometimes it feels like it was a lifetime ago. In some ways, I'm still the same person I was before it all happened, but in others, I'm completely different. I can't explain it, but I feel like I'm seeing the world with new eyes, as if a veil has been lifted, and I can finally see things clearly. The journey hasn't been easy, and I won't pretend that I've figured everything out. There are still days when I struggle, when the cravings hit, and I feel that familiar urge to reach for a cigarette, just to take the edge off. But now when that urge comes, I don't just feel it, I see it. I see it for what it really is, a shadow, a dark whisper trying to drag me back to a place I've worked so hard to escape. And every time I resist, every time I choose to push it away, I feel a little stronger, a little brighter. I didn't realize how much of my life I had been missing until I started living without the fog of nicotine clouding my mind. It's like waking up after a long, restless sleep, and realizing that there's a whole world out there that I had been too numb to appreciate. The simple things, like the taste of fresh air, the warmth of the sun on my face, or the way a deep breath feels when it fills my lungs, they're not things I ever thought about before. But now, they're small miracles, reminders that I'm still here, that I made it through. I've started sharing my story, tentatively at first, but with more confidence as time goes on. It began with a support group, where I met people who understood what I had been through, people who had their own battles with addiction, their own darkness to face. When I told them about my near-death experience, about the shadows and the light, I was afraid they'd think I was crazy. But instead, I saw nods of understanding, and for the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone. It was a relief to be able to talk about it, to get those thoughts out of my head and into the open, where they didn't feel so heavy, so suffocating. Word of my story began to spread, and soon I was being asked to speak at other meetings, even at schools and community centers. At first, it felt strange, standing in front of a room full of strangers, sharing something so personal, so raw. But I could see the way people listened, the way their eyes would light up with recognition when I talked about the fear, the doubt, the struggle to change. And I realized that my story wasn't just about me. It was about all of us, about the battles we fight every day, and the strength it takes to keep going, even when it feels impossible. I've had people come up to me after my talks, their eyes shining with tears, telling me that they've been trying to quit smoking for years, but they never felt like they could. They tell me that my story gave them hope, that it made them believe they could find their own light, their own strength. And every time I hear that, I feel a warmth spread through my chest, the same warmth I felt when I held that light in my hand, back in that strange, endless darkness. It's a reminder that I'm not just fighting for myself anymore. I'm fighting for them too, for everyone who's ever felt trapped, lost, or powerless. I'm not naive. I know that not everyone will understand. There are still people who look at me with skepticism, who think that what I experienced was just a hallucination, a trick of the brain brought on by a lack of oxygen. And maybe they're right, in a way. Maybe it was just my mind's way of processing everything I'd been through. But even if it was, it doesn't change the fact that it felt real, that it changed me. And isn't that what matters most? That something, whether real or imagined, has the power to transform us, to make us better, braver, kinder than we were before. I've learned to stop worrying about what others think. I know what I felt, and I know how it changed me, and that's enough. If sharing my story helps even one person find the strength to change, then it's worth it. Because that's what this is about, finding the courage to face our darkness, to hold onto our light, and to keep moving forward, no matter how many times we stumble along the way. Marie has been my biggest supporter through all of this. She comes to my talks whenever she can, even if she's heard the same story a dozen times. She tells me she's proud of me, that she's amazed by how far I've come, and every time she says it, I feel a lump in my throat, because I don't think I could have done any of this without her. She was there when I woke up in that hospital bed, and she's been there every step of the way since, helping me pick myself up whenever I felt like I was going to fall. I'm grateful for her, more than words can say, and I hope she knows that. There's one moment that stands out, a moment that I think about whenever I'm having a tough day, whenever I'm tempted to give up. It was a few weeks after I left the hospital, and I was sitting on the porch of my apartment, watching the sunset. Marie had come over to check on me, to make sure I was okay, and we were just sitting there, not saying much, just enjoying the quiet. Out of nowhere, she turned to me and said, "Do you remember what you told me when I was leaving the hospital that day? You said you'd be okay. And I didn't believe you. I was so scared, because I didn't know if you were strong enough to get through this. But look at you now. You're stronger than you've ever been. I'm so proud of you." I didn't know what to say. I just sat there, blinking back tears, because I hadn't felt strong. Most of the time, I felt like I was barely holding on, like I was just trying to make it through the day without falling apart. But hearing her say that, it made me realize that maybe strength isn't about feeling invincible. Maybe it's about finding the courage to keep going, even when you're scared, even when everything feels like it's falling apart. I'm still learning, still figuring out who I am without the cigarettes, without the excuses I used to hide behind. Some days are harder than others, but I'm getting there, one step at a time. And I've realized that it's okay to struggle, to stumble. It's okay to admit that I'm not perfect, that I don't have all the answers. Because the important thing is that I'm trying, that I'm choosing to fight, even when it's hard. There are moments sometimes when I think about that darkness, about the shadows and the figure that tried to pull me under. It still scares me, the memory of it, but I don't let it control me. Because now when I think about it, I also remember the light, the warmth, and the voice that told me I wasn't alone. And I hold on to that. I hold on to it like a lifeline, because I know that no matter how dark things get, there's always light to be found, if you're willing to look for it. People ask me sometimes if I regret what happened, if I wish I could go back and change things, avoid the heart attack, the hospital, the pain. And I tell them no. I wouldn't change it, even if I could. Because as terrifying as it was also the thing that woke me up, that made me realize how much of my life I had been wasting, how much I had been missing. It was the thing that forced me to confront my demons, to face the darkness head-on, and to find the strength I didn't even know I had. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened to me, or why I was given a second chance. But I do know that I'm not going to waste it. I'm going to keep fighting, keep sharing my story, keep trying to help others find their own light, even if it's just a tiny flicker. Because that's what we do, isn't it? We hold on to the light, and we pass it on, hoping it's enough to keep the darkness at bay. So here I am. Still standing, still fighting, still trying to be better than I was before. And for the first time in a long time, I can honestly say that I'm proud of myself. I'm proud of the person I'm becoming, the person who doesn't run from the darkness, but faces it, who doesn't give up, even when it's hard. And if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that we're all stronger than we think. We're all capable of more than we realize. Sometimes, it just takes a moment, a wake-up call, to remind us of that. And when that moment comes, when the light shines through the dark and shows us who we really are, we have a choice. We can either turn away, let the shadows pull us back under, or we can reach out, grab hold of that light, and fight like hell to keep it burning. I've made my choice. And no matter how hard it gets, no matter how many times I stumble, I am going to keep choosing the light. Because it's worth it. Life in all its messiness, its struggles, its beauty, it's worth it. And that's something I'm never going to forget.